Well, good morning, Valley Forge. My name is David Hertwick, and I serve as a pastor of a wonderful church in the suburbs of Syracuse, New York. New York. And my wife and I have been married for over 11 years. We have 3 little girls. Lilia is 9. Caroline is 7. She just got her ears pierced on Sunday. No tears, champ. It's amazing what girls will endure to get their ears pierced. Like, if she bumps her toe, she'll fall on the ground and weep for hours. But she let them punch holes in both her ears and didn't have any reaction at all. She's a champ. And then our littlest, Madeline, is 4. I hear spring break is next week. That's exciting. Winter break was last week for the high schools and elementary schools in Syracuse. And so my family and I got the opportunity to go away on a little vacation. And we spent a week in Boston, Massachusetts. Anybody from Boston? So I love the city. I love the vibe. The sports teams are an abomination before God, but I like everything else about Boston. And as we were preparing to go, I did what I always do when I travel. I spent a significant amount of time, maybe an unhealthy amount of time, online researching the food scene. Because I wanted to plan out all of my meals. They're like, what are you guys going to do on your vacation? Are you going to go to the aquarium, the zoo, the museum? Like, I didn't even know any of those things existed in Boston, but I can tell you where we're going to eat lunch on Wednesday. And one of the things I discovered in my research is that Boston, specifically the north end of Boston, which is like the Little Italy part of Boston, is well known for their cannolis. Now, I love cannolis. And there's 3 really famous bakeries on the north end of Boston that are basically within about a half a mile of each other. It's called Mike's Bakery, Modern Bakery, and Maria's Bakery. And they said these are the 3 bakeries that compete for best cannoli in Boston. So I did what I felt like I had a responsibility to do. I went to all 3 of them and tried all 3 cannolis. So on the right, you have the cannoli from Modern Bakery. The middle one is from Mike's Bakery, and the one on the left is from Maria's Bakery, which ended up being my favorite, Maria's Bakery. But all 3 of them were better than any cannoli I've ever had in my life. In fact, I am now ruined for cannolis. You know, we love, I think, as a people, ranking things, making lists, trying to determine what's the best place in town to get pizza, who's the greatest basketball player of all time, what's the funniest television show that you've ever seen. Yeah, you were obviously born after Michael Jordan. We love making lists and comparing things. In fact, sometimes it seems like we can't even enjoy something unless we make a list. Always trying to determine what was the greatest, what is the greatest. And this morning, we're going to look at a text in Mark chapter 9 where the disciples of Jesus are actually doing the exact same thing. They're trying to put together a list of the greatest. But it's not what was the greatest miracle Jesus ever did. It's not what's the greatest teaching he ever gave. They're actually trying to rank themselves. Who of us is the greatest? And we're going to look at this in Mark chapter 9. I'm going to read to you beginning in verse 33. We're just going to read 5 verses. It says this, that they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, speaking of Jesus, he asked them, speaking of the disciples, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. It's kind of like sometimes my daughters are fighting, and I'll walk into the room, and I'll be like, girls, what are you fighting about? And in that moment, they realize it was stupid, like they shouldn't have been fighting, and nobody wants to admit what they actually were fighting about. That's what's sort of happening here. In verse 35, it says that Jesus sat down and he called the 12. Now, in this culture at this time, when you sat down, that was taking the authoritative position of a teacher. Teachers would sit to teach. And so when Jesus sat down, and then it says that he called the 12, but the 12 were already there. What does this mean? It means that he basically called them to attention. So Jesus sits down in the authoritative position of a teacher. He calls them to attention, and it's like they know they're about to learn something. And he says, if anyone would be first, if anyone wants to be the greatest, he must be last of all and servant of all. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them, and taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, actually better translated, receives not only me, but him who sent me. So, in a world obsessed with finding and defining and arguing and debating over who's the greatest, Jesus teaches us in this text where we can find the greatest in his kingdom. and it's not where any of us would actually look. So where do we find the greatest? The first place that you find the greatest is last in line. Always last in line. This culture at this time, the Jewish culture, they were obsessed with questions of status and rank. There's a German New Testament scholar named Adolf Schattler, and he said this: "At all points in worship, in administration of justice, at meals, in all dealings, there constantly arose the question of who was greater, and estimating the honor due to each was a task which had constantly to be fulfilled and was felt to be very, very important." And so at this time, it was not unusual. This kind of helps us understand why the disciples would even be having this conversation. They were obsessed. They were focused on always trying to determine in any sort of social environment, any time where there was more than one person present, trying to determine in every setting who's the greatest, who's the most important, who's the most influential, always trying to determine. And the disciples are doing this, and Jesus knows they're doing it, and Jesus could have just let it go. He could have just said, well, this is just kind of the way things are. But Jesus doesn't let this go because there's so much at stake in the way that we measure greatness. So much at stake. And Jesus knew that these men were going to lead the early church. They were basically going to continue his life work and carry on the mission of God of spreading the good news of the gospel throughout the known world. Jesus knew that there was so much at stake in this moment that he sat down, he called them to attention, he said, you have to understand something. And the teaching that Jesus gives here is so radical. He radically refutes and rebukes and dismisses this mindset. He's basically saying, don't concern yourself with yourself. Well, good luck, right? Don't think about yourself. Don't concern yourself with your rank and your status and how you measure up to other people. And this teaching that Jesus gives is counternatural, it's counterintuitive, it was countercultural, it was all those things back then, and the truth is it still is today. We spend so much of our lives trying to get to the front of the line. Metaphorically, in our career, in school, in our relationships, in sports, whatever. So much of our energy trying to be noticed, to be seen. But sometimes literally, we're trying to get to the front of the line. I don't know how many of you have this experience now of going grocery shopping. Some of you probably live in environments where you have to go buy your own groceries. And when I go to the grocery store up in Syracuse, it's Wegmans. When I go to Wegmans, I'll load up my cart with all sorts of stuff. You know, I know some people shop like with a plan. Like my wife has a list. She actually has an app. You know, there's an app for everything. She's got a Wegmans app, and she'll go into the Wegmans store, and she knows exactly what she's getting, and she doesn't get one thing that's not on her list. She's very disciplined. You can guess what kind of shopper I am. I don't use a list. I use my stomach. And I just like follow around, and then I just grab things. I'm like, oh, pickles sound good. And then I'll spend 20 minutes looking at 6 different jars of pickles, like frozen by that simple decision. Like that's kind of my whole shopping journey. So by the time I get to the checkout area, I don't even know what's in my cart and how much I have. So the first thing I do is I count how much I have, because if I have less than 15, I get to go in the express lane. And so I count how much I have, but then if I don't have less than 15, what I begin to do is I look at all the lines, and of course, what am I looking for? The shortest line. And you do this, you're doing all these calculations in your brain in a split second. You're looking at the length of the line. You're actually looking into people's carts. You got no business looking in their carts, but you're looking in their carts because you want to determine how much food did that person buy, how long am I going to be stuck behind them. But then there's actually something else I do. I feel a little bad admitting this, but I look at the cashier, and I make a decision. I make a snap judgment. I'm not going to say based on what, but let's just be honest. Some people look like they're moving a little quicker than others. And so in that moment, I'm making all these decisions for the simple purpose of positioning myself closer to the front of the line to save myself what? Minutes. Because there's something in us that wants to get to the front of the line. It's a nightmare to be last in line. And in our work, in our play, and yes, even in our religious activity, we're always prone in our hearts to be trying to jockey and position ourselves and budge to the front of the line. Not content to be in the back, not willing to allow others to pass us by, especially those people or that person. We need to be seen. We're driven at all costs to be successful. We're determined to be the star. And I think your generation, I'm not that much older than you, so I'm part of it too, but I think your generation faces challenges that are unique in that you're really the first generation where your entire life has an audience all the time. I mean, you're growing up with an audience of your life because of social media 24/7. So everything you do, everything you post, every decision you make, you're doing it in the back of your mind, you're thinking of your audience. Who's going to see this? And sometimes it's not even the vastness of your audience, it's one person in your audience. And so you post something hoping that that one person will see it will like it, will comment on it, will message you back about it. It becomes very easy to live our lives in such a way where we're always positioning ourselves at the front of the line to be seen and to be noticed. And Jesus comes along and says, if you want to be first of all, you have to be last of all. You know what bothers me the most about what he says? It's the last word. Last of all. Like, I would be cool with letting a few people in front of me. You know, middle of the pack, I can deal with that. But last of all, like everyone, that person who thinks that, who believes that, who votes that way, who dresses that way, who treats me like that, last of them too. And Jesus is saying, yes, last. And the reason why last of all matters so much is because it's only when you and I are willing to be last in line that the ungodly ambition in our hearts can actually begin to die. We have to discipline ourselves to let every other person, regardless of their station in life or their status in the room, to pass you by. Now listen, let me give you a little caveat here. I'm not talking about an eagerness to be overlooked or an eagerness to be passed by, but a willingness. It's not like I'm eager to be overlooked because you have a victim mentality, but I'm willing to be passed by. I'm willing to allow others to shine and for myself to fade into the background. And if I can share my opinion for you or with you for just a moment about, I feel like this is an issue in American Christianity now in some really significant ways. Because we have this combination of technology and resources and social media that has created these things that we call celebrity pastors. And pastors who are using the strategy of building an online platform. And even New York Times did an article last month about pastors who were discovered to be purchasing fake followers on social media to drive up their follow count. And I'm not trying to throw them under the bus. They may not have known it was happening. They probably don't even run their own Twitter account. I get it. But here's my concern in American Christianity, and this matters to you because most of you are going to be heading back, or not most of you, but some of you are going to be serving in a local church, or at least a part of a local church. And my concern is that technology, social media, is redefining what success and health looks like for the local church. And we've got the wrong scoreboard. We've got the wrong metrics. And so now, here's what happens. We think a church is successful or healthy based on things like this: the quality and the look and the sound of the band, the stage production, the design and the aesthetics of the meeting room, the size and the quality of the screens, the coffee in the lobby, the branding, the promotional materials, the number of tweetable one-liners that you can get out of a little 20-minute inspirational talk. Now listen, is that all bad stuff? Of course not. I'm not trying to be unfair or harsh, but here's what I'm trying to say. As the people of God, who have a different definition of greatness than the world, we need to be a little bit wary of those things. We need to suspect them more than we currently do, I think. We need not to welcome them so without so much thought. And we need to pay attention and make sure that you and I aren't using all our energy to run the wrong race, to race up the wrong ladder with the wrong motivation of being seen and successful by standards that actually have very little to do with the kingdom that Jesus came to inaugurate, but it's actually much more in keeping with the kingdom of this world. So what might it look like to be last in line? I got some thoughts for you. If you're last in line as a disciple of Jesus, you're going to be willing to do things that no one else will do. You're going to be willing to go where no one else wants to go. When you graduate from Valley Forge and there's opportunities to go serve in churches, you'll be the person who's willing to go somewhere where everyone else say, that's not interesting, that's not shiny and sexy and amazing and huge and all these different things that we look for when we look at where we're going to serve and what church we're going to land at. You'd be willing to stay in one place for a long time and serve faithfully, willing to not be celebrated and applauded for every good thing you do. It won't bother you when someone doesn't mention your name. You're willing, this is a tough one, willing to celebrate others who surpass you in your abilities, especially if it's an ability that you wrap your identity in. And then seeing the best in others, saying, I'm going to let you go ahead. I'm going to let you outshine me. This is going to be an issue, by the way, for those of you that are going to Mexico and to Haiti as a team. How much would it change your team if every single one of you was pushing the other one forward? Letting the other one be seen. I'm going to be last. I don't need to be seen. I don't need to shine. I don't need my moment because I'm a part of a kingdom where the greatest, the first, are last of all. Second thing is that the greatest in the kingdom are not just last in line, but they're first to serve. Jesus is last of all, and then he says servant of all. And the Greek word for servant here is diakonos. And the word here is basically describing someone who waits on tables. in a room full of college students, I know some of you wait on tables. What do waiters do? Well, they're attentive, at least they're supposed to be. They anticipate my needs. Like, I feel so loved when my water gets refilled without me having to ask. Like, that's one of my love languages. I'm really encouraged by that. I don't have to chase down the waiter or the waitress. They offer helpful suggestions. They lay aside their preferences in that moment for yours, their needs for yours. Can you imagine if a waiter is like, I'll bring your food in a moment, but first I got to eat my food, right? That's not how this works. And a waiter or a waitress serves, or they don't choose who they serve or how they serve based on their personal preference. So when we think about ourselves as servants of all, what does that mean? How do we, once again, that three-letter word all, how do we serve one another? We're attentive to each other. We pay attention to each other's needs. We anticipate each other's needs. When I was leading students on missions trips, I was a youth pastor for 12 years, DYD for 7 years, now I'm a pastor. But when I led missions trips, we would have this value called serve aggressively. Seems like a weird combination of verb and adverb, but essentially it means don't wait to be asked. Like, look around, find opportunities to serve, and go after it, and serve. And the other thing about serving, the way that Jesus is talking about here, is that you will serve people, and you'll serve in positions, and you'll serve in ways that actually you don't necessarily prefer. Because there are some people who say, yes, I'm willing to serve, but they want to maintain control and say over how they serve, when they serve, and who they serve. But if that's the way you serve, is that really what Jesus is talking about here? And we're really professionals at walking into any room and making a snap judgment about who's in the room and who's worthy of your time and who you should spend your time with. And we have this propensity to sort of spend time with people who make us look better or advance our cause or advance our agenda. And Jesus is saying, don't just serve people who seem to be above you, but serve those who seem to be below you. Serve people who can do nothing for you and nothing to advance your agenda. As disciples of Jesus, we're called to radical servanthood. This is servanthood that costs us something and servanthood that makes no sense to other people. So ask yourself that question. Am I serving currently, whether it's in a church or at the school or in your place of work, am I currently serving in a way that's costing me something? It's inconveniencing me. It's not my preference. It doesn't let me shine all the time. It's actually something that's stretching me and growing me. And am I serving in a way that doesn't make sense to people who aren't in the kingdom? If the answer is no to both of those questions, then chances are you're not the servant of all. So the greatest in the kingdom are last in line and they're first to serve. We all love the visible serving opportunities, being on stage, being seen. But there's so many opportunities to serve that are never seen. Jesus goes on after this, and he kind of provides this illustrated sermon. He pulls in a little child, and he says, if you're going to receive, whoever receives a child like this in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives not only me, but receives the one who sent me. Now, this is a great illustrated sermon back then. It actually doesn't have the same impact today as it did then. And the reason why is basically the position of children in society. Like today, children are highly valued. I know they're still exploited in some terrible ways in certain environments. But in our society, mostly in America, children are they're almost idols, really. We've elevated children to a position where we protect them at all costs, we worship them, we build our lives around them. I mean, when I was a kid, when I got into a car with my parents, I was going where they were going. Now, when parents get into cars with kids, they're going where the kid happens to be going. I mean, the whole thing is sort of flipped around. And so that's the society that we live in. So when we see this idea of Jesus welcoming kids, we're like, it's kind of heartwarming, but what's the big deal? We all would welcome in a kid. What kind of a jerk wouldn't welcome in a kid? But in this time in history, children occupied a very precarious position in this Hellenistic society. Sometimes children, of course, were cared for and looked after, but many times they were exploited. For example, in history, you can find a copy of a papyrus letter that was written by a man to his wife who was pregnant, dated June 17th, 1 BC, and it instructs her, if it's a male child, let it live, and if it's a female, cast it out. As late as 60 AD 60, a son could be put to death by the simple order of his father. In fact, it wasn't until hundreds of years after Jesus was on earth that infanticide was actually declared illegal by the Roman Empire. So when Jesus calls this child in and gives this illustration on greatness and how to treat other people, Jesus is basically saying, find the people in your life who can do nothing for you, who have no value in society's eyes, who have no worth, and welcome them in. So who are those people today? Who are those people for you? Who are those people in the eyes of the church? The people who have no value, the people who have no worth, the people that we overlook. When you receive that person, you receive Jesus. And you recognize the simple truth that every person bears the image of God and is worth the life of his Son. All right, let me wrap this up. So at this point, surely the disciples get the point, right? They must understand now, okay, you want to be first, you got to be last, you got to be servant of all. They must get it, right? Wrong. Very next chapter, we come across a story in Mark chapter 10. James and John, two of Jesus' closest followers, come up to Jesus and they say to him, Jesus, give us whatever we want. Like, if you're a parent, by the way, that's a trap. Don't ever, that's a bad question. So Jesus very patiently says, well, what do you want? And James and John say, we want, when you enter into your kingdom, when you enter into your glory, seat one of us on your right-hand side and seat one of us on your left-hand side. Basically what's happening here is James and John believe that Jesus is the Messiah. They've kind of had this moment in Mark chapter 8 where Peter has declared, you're the Messiah, you're the Son of God. James and John in the beginning of Mark chapter 9 were on the Mount Transfiguration, so they've seen some pretty mystical, weird stuff, and they're beginning to believe, and they're like, okay, Jesus is definitely the Messiah. He's definitely going to reign and rule. Let's position ourselves to be on his right-hand side and his left-hand side as sort of his number 2 guy and his number 3 guy. And then Jesus, his response is really weird. Jesus' response, he starts to go into this idea of like, well, can you drink the cup that I'm going to drink? And can you be baptized into what I'm going to be baptized? And they say, yeah. They don't know what they're talking about. But they say, yeah, we can. He says, well, you will in time, but it's not to me to grant who sits on my right and my left. That's the work of the Father. Now, the 12, or the other 10 disciples hear about this interaction and they get indignant, which I think is kind of ironic because they're all struggling with this in their hearts. They all want to be the greatest. And let me just give you this little insight. The things that bother you the most in other people are very often things that are in you too. And that's what happens here. In verse 42, Jesus calls them together. And let me read this to you. It'll be on the screen for you. Jesus called them to him and he said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles, they lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. So he's saying, people that are in leadership outside of the kingdom of God who don't have the ethics and the practice and the morality and the spirituality of the people of God, they use their power to work other people, to abuse other people. I mean, you don't have to look very far in the news to see this happening in our society. People who use their power in ways that are manipulative and abusive. Then verse 43, Jesus says, but it shall not be so among you. He's saying it cannot be this way with you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. There's that same word again. And whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. Now here Jesus switches his words and he goes to a Greek word called doulos. And this is a step up. This is from a waiter to a slave. It's like Jesus is thinking they're not getting this. So he ramps up his language to say, hey, you're not just helping other people. There is a way in which you are indebted to the people that you serve. There's a way in which you owe your life to others because you don't own your own life. We're going to see in a minute that Jesus is going to go to the cross and he's going to purchase us with his life. You've been bought with a cross, so you've been bought with a price, so you don't own yourself anymore. So glorify God with your life, and in a real way, we're indebted to one another, and we're indebted to every image bearer to serve him. And then verse 45, Jesus says these words, for even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Listen, if anyone had the right to say, serve me, don't you think it was the Son of God who spoke the universe into existence, who, according to the author of Hebrews, sustains everything just through the power of his word, or the word of his power? Jesus laid it all down. Paul says in Philippians that Jesus humbled himself. He came, God who became man, who became a servant, who died a death, but not just any death, but the death of a criminal on a cross. You know what I think is the saddest thing about these two encounters, Mark 9 and Mark 10, where in Mark 9 they're arguing about who's the greatest, and in Mark 10 James and John are trying to position themselves to be the greatest? If you read that whole context, you know what everything else surrounding those two stories is for the most part? It's Jesus beginning to talk about the cross. He's finally beginning to sort of pull back the veil and say to his disciples, hey, I'm going to die. Like, I came here to die, to give my life for you. In the midst of that, the disciples are saying, I'm the greatest. No, I'm the greatest. I was on the mountain. You weren't on the mountain. I saw this. I didn't see this. And the truth is still in the kingdom of God today, we're like that. We're trying to edge each other out. We're trying to prove ourselves. We're trying to get to the front. And at the center of our faith is the humiliation of our own God, who says, I will give my life as a ransom for many. Now that word ransom, when we hear the word ransom, what do you think of? You think of kidnapping? You think of hostage? That's not what it meant here. In the Greek, this word ransom means to buy the freedom for a prisoner or a slave. And when he said, I came to give my life as a ransom for many, the word for there is a Greek word that actually means as a substitute, in the place of, instead of. So here's what Jesus is saying. I came to pay a price that you really should have paid. I came to set you free by paying a price that's really your responsibility. It's on you, but you can't do it. And this is the first time where Jesus shifts from talking about the fact that he will die to the reason why he will die in the Gospel of Mark. And now he says, here's why I will die, to be a ransom for many. Let's be honest this morning. You and I, we have a lot in common with James and John, trying to budge to the front of the line and look for opportunities to be served and outshine other people and be noticed and appreciated for who we are and what we can do. We come to God like James and John and we say, give me whatever I want. You know what I think the Spirit was trying to say to our hearts this morning? You need way more than a spot at the front of the line. It'll never satisfy you. There'll always be another line. You need way more than getting your needs met, because life isn't about you. You need way more than the self-serving requests that we bring to God and we call them prayer. God's saying you need salvation from those very things, from your sin, from your selfishness. See, the greatest values in our culture today are things like self-actualization, self-realization, self-promotion. And then the kingdom of God flies in the face of that and says things like this: self-denial, die to self, self-forgetfulness. It's so radical. It's so different. And it's so easy for us to miss. It's so easy for us to put the cloak of religious activity on, but still have the heart of this world's kingdom. To look like we're serving others, but really be serving ourselves. So Jesus says, you don't need any of the things you think you're asking for. You need to be saved. You need your very heart to be changed and to be pulled away from loving the wrong things most. And so Jesus says, here's the deal. I'm not going to give you what you're asking for, those small petty things. I'm going to give you myself. I'm going to give you my very life. And that's what he did. This is the beginning of the turning point in the Gospel of Mark. The very next chapter, Jesus is in Jerusalem, riding in on a donkey, headed to the cross, where he deliberately gave his life for us so that we could be reconciled to God and saved from our own selfishness and sin. And Tim Keller says this. He says that all life-changing love is ultimately substitutionary sacrifice. Let me say that again. All life-changing love, the only type of love that will change your life and my life, will change your heart and my heart, has in its nature substitutionary sacrifice. I gave myself up for you. That's the sort of love that changes our life. Now, why does this matter? Let me close with this. 10 years ago, the New York Times Magazine ran an article entitled Happiness 101. The basic gist of the article was this: if you live for yourself and if you live for pleasure, you'll never be happy. You'll be on a treadmill, like a hedonistic treadmill all the time, trying to get more. Oh, you like that piece of chocolate? Well, there's a bigger piece of chocolate. You like that pleasurable moment? There's more. You like that drug? There's one that's going to get you higher than that drug did. You like feeling respected? Well, that person doesn't respect you yet. Go earn their respect. You get it? You're on a hedonistic treadmill to get more and more pleasure, more and more things, thinking it will make you happy. And then the article concludes with this thought: the best way to bring meaning to our own lives and to have the sense that our lives are significant and to be happy and feel good about ourselves is actually to lead an unselfish life of service to other people. Well, that's good advice. Like, I actually kind of agree, but here's the problem, and you get it, you're smart. If you're leading an unselfish life to make yourself happy, how unselfish is it really? So how do we serve others? Not in a roundabout way to serve ourselves. There's only one way. Jonathan Edwards, in his book, The Nature of Virtue, said this: if you don't believe the gospel of grace, grace. Grace. If you believe on any level that you are saved by your works, even your willingness to get in the end of the line or your willingness to serve all, if you think being last in line and being willing to serve will save you, will satisfy what God has required of you, will justify you before the eyes of a righteous and holy God, then this is what Jonathan Edwards concludes. If that's your mentality, if that's your heart position, which Martin Luther said it's the default mode of all of our human hearts, then you've never done anything, even the best things in your life, for the love of others. You've done it for yourself. You haven't helped the proverbial little old lady across the street just for her sake, or in the end for God's sake. You've done it because then you can look at yourself in the mirror and know, I'm the kind of person who helps little old ladies across the street. And you can expect to go to heaven someday because of it. Here's the problem. It's selfish, it will become drudgery, and it will lead you either to arrogance or despair. There's no other options. Arrogance when you think you've succeeded, and despair when you think you've failed. And all of your serving in the end will be self-serving. Everything you do on a stage like this will be to be seen, to be noticed, to build up your own personal resume so that you can be impressive to others, but ultimately so that you can be impressive to God, trying to manufacture a righteousness of your own apart from what Christ has done. And can I tell you that there's nothing in this world more exhausting than trying to manufacture your own righteousness and manage your own sin? You know, you've tried. Managing your sin, manufacturing your righteousness, hoping that you're more good than you're bad, not knowing where the standard is, wondering if you've been good enough, feeling closer to God on days that you remember to do your devotions, and then wondering if you're lost on days where you watch something that you shouldn't have watched. If Jesus Christ is just an example of getting last in line and being first to serve, well, then now it's on you to measure up. And in that case, all your serving will ultimately be self-serving. You will get in the back of the line and you'll sign up to serve. You'll do it over and over and over and over, but always because you're trying to earn something that can't be earned. So what breaks the cycle? Jonathan Edwards said it. It's the gospel of grace. It's hearing Jesus say, I came not to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many, to do for you what you can never do for yourself, to absorb the wrath of God, but also to secure the welcome of God. Jesus' work on your behalf doesn't just sort of get you off the hook. That's not enough. It's not enough to have a clean slate, because what are you going to fill that clean slate with? Your goodness? No way. Jesus didn't just get you off the hook when he went to the cross. He also filled your slate with his righteousness, with his goodness, with his performance. So that what that means, as Matt Chandler says, is that God the Father, when he looks at you this morning, if you believe fully and solely, if you trust fully and solely in the person and work of Jesus Christ, that God the Father looks at you this morning and sees you not as a better version of yourself, not as a 2018 version of yourself, not as a cleaned up version of yourself, not as a less likely to cuss and lose your temper version of yourself. He sees you as if you lived the life that Jesus lived, because Jesus came to give his life as a ransom for many. And when we see Jesus paying the ransom in our place, you know what it does? It makes us joyful even when we're at the end of any line. It makes us reject all the other things that we would build our identity on. We see sin, listen, not just as wrong. It's not about wrongness, although it's wrong. It's about worthlessness. Sin's not just bad, it's worthless. And the prophets say that idols are worthless things that in the end will make you worthless because you become what you worship. When we see the gospel, it motivates us to serve regardless of the reward. It makes us the greatest in the kingdom, and we move from I have to serve to I want to serve. Last thing I'll say, in the kingdom, the way to glory is sacrifice, service, and suffering. How's that for a tagline? How's that for a sales pitch? Join the kingdom. I guarantee you three things: sacrifice, service, and suffering. But when you've seen the Son of God laying his life down for you, here's what happens. It becomes a willing sacrifice. It becomes selfless service, and it becomes humble suffering, and you'll be last in line, and you'll be first to serve. Let's pray together this morning. Spirit of God, I ask that you would do what I am unable to do. That you would seal the truth of these words to the hearts of your people. That you would bring about genuine heart change, genuine repentance, turning from lesser loves to the one true love, seeing the wrongness and the worthlessness of the heart idols that we cling to, and turning to Jesus, the one who gave his life for us, who came not to be served but to serve, to make us a people who are always last in line and first to serve. I pray for the University of Valley Forge that this would be a community filled with servants, not always positioning themselves to be seen, to get on stage, to shine, to have their moment, to be appreciated, to be applauded, but people who are willing to push others to the front. Let them be seen. Let them be noticed. I'm content to be last of all. I'm content to be servant of all because of the work of Jesus Christ on my behalf.